Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Very excited for today's guest. He is not a first-timer. I believe he's a second-timer. And I'll tell you the genesis of this is I wanted to write a column for the LA Times about how 2024 is shaping up to be a vibes election rather than an issues election. And it feels a lot like 1992 to me. And while I was Googling around for some data and stuff, his Substack, which is great, it's called Tusk, came up, and it was all on this point. So I'm grateful to Seth Masket from the University of Denver. He's a political scientist. He was last on when he talked about party stuff and all that. People know my thing about how parties are broken. He wrote a book called Learning from Loss: The Democrats 2016 to 2020. He also wrote The Inevitable Party: Why Attempts to Kill the Party System Fail. Well, that may have reached its shelf life. And he's working on a new book about the Republican Party in the age of Trump and how all this happened. And I'm looking forward to that. And we'll have him back on for that. And that's going to be called, at least the working title, The Elephants in the Room. So with that, Seth Masket, welcome back to the Remnant.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So why don't we just sort of start where I mentioned it in the intro. The reason I think it feels like 1992 is I was a young kid just out of college, and I could not bring myself, I was conservative, all that stuff. I could not bring myself to vote for George H.W. Bush. I regret it now. I think he was a deeply honorable dude and one of the last sort of just hyper competent sort of old school kind of Republican presidents. But I was so exhausted with him. It just felt like we needed a change so bad. I couldn't vote for the Democrats. So I ended up writing in Andre Maru, the Libertarian candidate. Not something I'm hugely proud of, but I was young. When I was young and irresponsible, I was young and irresponsible. And it just feels very similar to that to me. When you listen to young progressives who obviously don't want to vote for Trump, but they just feel like just enough with Biden. It's a very vibey kind of thing. And as you wrote, the presidential approval and the economy don't really seem to be linked anymore, or at least not as reliably as they once were. So, just do you think vibes is a thing, and how do you think about that?
I think in most election years, I kind of dismiss the idea of vibes, and this year I'm having a hard time doing that. And I think there are a lot of those parallels that you were talking about there. For one thing, you have what I think in hindsight is going to look like a pretty effective one term for Joe Biden. I don't know what's going to happen in the next election, but that, similar to George Bush Sr., that was a term of pretty considerable accomplishments. He was, I think of like a very solid mainstream party figure in President Bush at the time. But someone who is just really not loved by what you might call movement conservatives, not really trusted by people who were brought into politics with Reagan, and just, never fully trusted him for a number of reasons, some of which had to do with supporting a tax cut, but some of which there was always a certain level of distrust there, that someone who was just sort of, I guess, like mouthing the words of Reaganism without a lot of commitment. But like mostly a pretty good term. But got hit with, pretty rough economic news in his final year in office. And there was this sense, talking with folks who were involved with that campaign, and just, I remember, I think you and I are almost just about the same age. I was, following it at the time. There was a sense that, well, okay, the worst of the economic problems were behind us in 1992. Mm-hmm. And he stood, in a good place to kind of pick up popularity as the economy recovered. And the economy was recovering that year. It took a while for unemployment to go back down. But, growth had returned. A lot of businesses that were teetering on the brink in 91 were recovering in 92. And he just was not benefiting from it.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of ways in which, coming back to the vibes thing, there actually is some political science literature. There's some studies showing that, when it comes down to what people think the economy is doing and what the economy is like actually doing, but what it's actually doing usually is a better predictor of how people are going to vote. That is, even if people are feeling kind of grumpy about it, if there's growth, the incumbent tends to get reelected. And if there isn't, he tends to get thrown out. And 1992 is kind of an exception to that, where it was growing, but people didn't believe it. People were convinced the economy was in the crapper. And Bill Clinton really was very good at running on that issue. He really capitalized on that. But I don't think he created that belief. I think that belief was already there. And I think you have a similar story with Biden, where it's he didn't even have much of a recession to deal with, but there's still a sense that inflation was high. People are convinced it remains high, even though it's gone back down. People are convinced we're in a recession, even though growth is decent and unemployment is low. And it's hard for him to convince them otherwise. And so you just have this sort of belief that, I'm just tired of this. I want change, which is very non-specific, but it's absolutely killing him. And it's killing him among people who would otherwise be with a Democratic candidate, I think. Younger voters of color who are just not sold on Biden right now.
Yeah, I mean, I want to get back to the vibe thing in a second, but I do think it's worth pointing out that we really, when we were kids, there was serious inflation. But you have to be our age to have any living memory of it, or older. And I do think that one of the, I'm one of these guys who always thinks every bad thing has a silver lining and every good thing has a downside. And there was a growing argument on the part of the sort of very committed progressive left that inflation was just kind of a bugaboo, right? And it wasn't really a thing. We didn't need to worry about it. We can do the Green New Deal. We can do, whatever that, the new monetary theory thing, MMT, modern monetary theory. You had Rick Perlstein convinced himself that concern over inflation in the 1970s was actually metaphorical, that it was really about cultural backlash to feminism and whatnot, not like gas prices. And then, of course, but now I don't think any serious political person wants ever to have to be held responsible for inflation again for another generation, right? As Edmund Burke would say, examples of the school of mankind, and we must learn it. He will learn it no other. Sometimes you actually have to relearn some lessons, and politically, inflation just sucks, right? It just, everyone feels it. And when you say it's going down, I agree it's going down, but it's the rate of increase that's going down. And people still look at the prices that we're getting some disinflation. We're not getting deflation, right? So people, when they look at their prices in the grocery store,
there's still sticker shock there. Yeah.
They're still really high. And it's sort of like saying, okay, it's gone, it's a super hot summer day and it's gone from 98 to 99. So the rate of increase isn't going up as much. Or even if it's gone from 98 to 95, it's still freaking hot out, right? That's, I think, the mood of people. But on the vibe thing, I guess so I have a theory about this. I'm curious what you think. I can't remember it was either for the Atlanta or the Washington Post. He did this piece and he interviewed me about it, and I can't even remember who it was. But there was a thing about how anti-Biden books didn't sell, right? It was anti-Obama books sold, anti-Hillary books sold, right? And part of my argument is that it's very difficult to turn Joe Biden into the radical other, right? Like Obama, whether it was the stupidity of the birther stuff or Hillary with, where I toiled quite a bit with her Alinsky past and all these kinds of things, it was possible to make them seem scary, for right wingers. Obama, he's been this ward healing guy since 1974, right? In Congress, people know who he is, and they may think he's a blowhard and all these other things, but he's not. You can't turn him into the dangerous other and make him exotic the way you could with other Democrats. And that's, I thought, one of the reasons why books about him wouldn't sell is because they're just boring. I kind of feel like that's also true in an era of high polarization and negative polarization. It's also a problem to keep your own people in line, because the one thing that will get people to rally around you are vicious ideological attacks from shared enemies. Biden gives young, hungry, idealistic progressives very little exciting to run out and defend. And I think that's, in this age of sort of cable news, ginned up stuff and Twitter stuff, he's just a poor fit in certain ways. And I think that's part of the thing that contributes to the vibes.
I think there's something to that. And again, it comes back to a pretty vibesy answer, where I think if you had described some of the changes that Biden has, I think gets legitimate credit for during his term, including like a fair amount of student loan forgiveness, even if not everything that progressives wanted, including a fair amount of like investment in climate change legislation and, investing in electric vehicles and battery storage and things like that. If you just sort of described that to progressives back in 2020, I think probably a lot of them would have said, well, no way we'll get all that.
Right.
Right. And, if you had associated that with it, I assume that Bernie Sanders won. That's what you're describing, right? Like, but Joe Biden has never been the person that they associate with changes like that. They, for the same reason, I think Democrats largely nominated him in 2020 was because he was kind of the safe old grandpa. He was not terrifying. He was hard, as you pointed out, he was hard for them to hate, like Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton. He was just sort of seen as, as not particularly dangerous. But also for the same reason, progressives don't find him all that exciting. They aren't passionate about him. And that can work. Like, that's actually pretty good for most of the time for like winning a party's nomination, is not necessarily being something that like a faction of your party cares deeply about. It's just sort of like everyone's second favorite. The guy who everyone will tolerate is usually a pretty good choice of candidate. But right now, it's really undermining him, in his pursuit of a second term. And, people who I think were a big part of the reason why he got in the first place are just not in his corner yet. Now, you've still got 6 months, but wow, are they unenthusiastic for him right now?
Yeah. I mean, you can always do it's just a snapshot thing with this new New York Times Siena poll, but like it's a snapshot that confirms a pretty long-standing trend now. It's very difficult to see. I'm all against straight line projections, but like from the present to the future, but like there should be more flop sweat among Democrats, it seems to me. All right, so let's longtime listeners of the podcast know that one of my obsessions is the weakness of parties, and parties are a mess, and that weak parties create strong partisanship and all of these sorts of things. I can't remember where we went around the horn on this last time, but how healthy do you think the parties are? I mean, do you think where do you come down on the party decides thesis, right? This is your bread and butter, right? Like, does the party decide? Are the parties really a thing these days? And if they are, what thing are they?
So I see, my impression is that the parties are in two very different places on this right now. Mm-hmm. That Democrats still have evidence of party leaders who can still make decisions that, they can't go wildly against their voters, but they're still capable of making some sort of, coordinating on candidates and making decisions. So I think we saw that in 2020. I think you and I have had some disagreement about what exactly happened in 2020, but, my impression was that, Democrats had a large and, many ways, pretty impressive field of qualified candidates. They were overwhelmingly like party insiders, party donors, people who are just sort of long-standing involvement with the Democratic Party, pretty strongly leaned toward Joe Biden or someone like him, kind of an inoffensive, relative centrist, and picked him precisely because they thought he was electable and they weren't sure candidates like Elizabeth Warren or Kamala Harris or Bernie Sanders were. And that was a choice they made. They steered the party in that direction. They pushed other candidates like Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar out because they didn't think they could win, and they wanted to consolidate the Democratic vote. And so, and they, to the extent that the party was active in 2020, like it's very rare that a party like goes after its own incumbent, even if he's looking a little unpopular. We haven't seen that in like 4 decades, basically.
Right.
But to the extent Democrats are capable of making decisions, I think they are, and I think they lean toward electability, but they're mostly making reasonable decisions, albeit ones that that are not wildly outside what their voters want. I think the Republican Party is in a very different place. I don't think they're capable. I think there's a fair number of people within the party establishment, quote unquote, who are still not super comfortable with Donald Trump, who I think a year ago weren't sure he could win another term, and did not know what to do with that information. They had no idea how to organize against him. And they ultimately see that, sort of passionate voters are in charge of that party right now. And they don't want to be too far away from what those voters want, because they think it'll, if they organize against Trump and Trump wins, they're going to find themselves out of a job. It's going to end their political careers. And so you get this result where party elites rally behind Donald Trump because they're scared of the opposite. They're scared of opposing him. So I think you have a much more bottom-up party among Republicans right now than among Democrats, and much more so than the Republican Party ever really was before 2016. The added wrinkle there is that you also have two parties that overwhelmingly defer to their incumbents, and that's pretty long-standing feature of U.S. politics. But
sure,
I don't know that it needs to be automatic, right? You can imagine a system where parties take much more seriously the idea, well, maybe these are problematic candidates and we don't have to automatically renominate them. But I tend to think they probably would have come up with these guys anyway. Mm-hmm. Like, for Democrats, at least a year ago, right? When this could have been more competitive. For Democrats evaluating Joe Biden, they look at this is a guy who delivered on a lot of issues that they care about. He's pretty good at keeping the Democratic coalition together, at least up until that point he was. And also he's like the one guy who ever beat Donald Trump at anything. And so, why do you throw that out in favor of a much more unknown quantity? And Republicans, I don't know that they were ever very seriously entertaining the idea of someone else. I mean, maybe a year ago it looked more competitive than it was, but even if it wasn't a party that was going to automatically defer to its most recent presidential nominee, I think they, a lot of the most passionate folks in the party just really like the guy.
Yeah, I completely agree and take your point about, incumbent presidents run again if they want to. That is a very old story in American politics, because incumbent presidents, even before the horrible decisions on primaries and campaign finance reform, they were still the heads of their parties, right? And I think Nixon was willing to listen to party elders in a way that you wouldn't get today. When he was basically, it's hard to know, right? Goldwater and Bush and those guys go up there and they say, you don't have the votes, you're going to get impeached. So that's the reason he goes, more than do it for your party. But there's still a kind of double role there in the fact that if you had a similar thing with Donald Trump would say, well, then go fight for me and prevent this or I'll kill you, right? Which is just not,
right.
Not the way Nixon would have done. So I get it with Biden. At the same time, there are a lot of Democrats who I talk to them sometimes in green rooms in Washington, D.C., and away from microphones and other contexts, who even a year ago thought it would be just something's got to give. You can't have an 82-year-old running for president. He's lost a step or two. And lots of people saying, got to get Kamala off of that ticket and blah, 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 blah. And they always would come around to the fact that unless they decide to do it, there's just nothing that can be done about that. It does seem to me, though, on the Republican side, the structural thing is different, where I think, for the reasons you lay out, where it seems one of the places where I think there's a lot of commonality, though, is the role of small donors. The incentive structures on the right and left, if you go through the list of the biggest small donor contributor, recipients, it's like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lindsey Graham and AOC and Warnock, and Warnock's kind of an outlier, but people who actually cultivate bases outside of the party regulars, that aren't actually trying to get a lot of legislation done, that are simply trying to have this direct relationship with voters and or with small donors. And when you have that, there's very little the party apparatus can do to tell Marjorie Taylor Greene, shut the hell up, right? She's not relying on them for money. She's not relying on them for media. So all she's relying them for is, an R next to her name. And I don't see, and I see a similar, Alexandria AOC, my understanding is that she basically just renames post offices, doesn't get a lot of legislative stuff done because she's much more charming and she's, I think, much smarter than Marjorie Taylor Greene, but their basic orientation towards their parties is they are enemies of their own establishments and their own parties, and they get this organic connection with their small donors by calling out the establishments of their own parties and making life difficult for them. And it seems to me the parties, if they're ever going to get their crap together, they need to have some sticks and carrots, but I prefer the sticks, for imposing some discipline on their own parties. Because otherwise, and that's been Trump's advantage all along, is his ability to sort of, you work the mob, and then the mob puts pressure on the institutionalists who then either leave or cave. How do you fix that?
Yeah, that's a rough one. And I honestly, I see and again, I think, as I was saying before, I think Democrats and Republicans are in different places in terms of this. I think when the Democratic Party exerts its strength, it's way more on the preliminary nomination side. So when you have a presidential race or a congressional race, I think they're much more serious about screening for the right type of candidate, making sure that their choice gets a lot of the institutional support and usually wins. I think AOC is a big and important exception to that. She's obviously someone who ran against the establishment candidate in the Democratic primary, was not the party's choice. But that's a pretty rare event on the Democratic side. And the Republican side, I think there's a lot less screening that goes on, and you do get more. You get these Marjorie Taylor Greenes or Lauren Boeberts, George Santos, and Republicans for the most part, I think they're less worried about that stage of it, and they'll figure out, well, we'll deal with this in post. If it becomes a real problem, we'll we'll somehow figure out a way to drive George Santos out of politics. Or they'll do this once in a while, maybe once per Congress, they'll just throw out some really messy millennial or something like that. But they don't worry so much about screening people on the way in. But once people are in, it becomes a lot harder to police them. Particularly, as you point out, when they have their own donor base or they're in a pretty safe district. There's, it's a system that doesn't really lend itself well to a lot of party discipline. And, to some extent you've had, I think when Pelosi was speaker, I think she exerted some power that way just by cultivating her own. There were a bunch of funds within Congress that she controlled, and she was despite her sort of longstanding liberal reputation, she was pretty much a very strong institutionalist, and people who were sort of not in her good graces had a harder time getting that money, and she could kind of manipulate Democrats to some extent by saying, look, if you want access to this, I can make your life easier for running for re-election if you do what the party needs you to do. Obviously, if you're good at raising your own money, you can push back on that to some extent. I don't think Republican speakers have been quite as effective on that. Either they haven't raised as much money or they're reticent to use it. But for the most part, you have this big presence out there in Donald Trump, who, if you're in his good graces, you have access to a very powerful endorsement. You have access to your own sources of money that, the sort of more institutional side of the establishment just can't compete with. And there's no real figure like that on the left, as far as I can tell, who exerts that kind of anti-institutionalist choice there. One little nugget about AOC there. I don't know how wonky this is, but she's become kind of a slight nightmare for the nerdier political scientists, in the sense that we have all these great tools for figuring out, we have all this sophisticated math for figuring out how liberal and conservative members of Congress are just from their voting record. We have, these formulas that we've been using for decades to, figure out people's quote unquote ideal points, how liberal or conservative they are based on their voting behavior in Congress. And AOC always screws that up because she votes with the Republicans a fair amount of the times against Democratic bills because they're not liberal enough for her. And that's not usually what people in Congress do. They usually vote with their party, and you can see. So she looks like a moderate. She votes like John Hickenlooper. That's really not helpful. So we just sort of say, okay, these tools work great except for AOC. So Yeah.
But all her votes are very much like the left-wing equivalent of like the House Freedom Caucus guys who vote against stuff because they want to make the perfect the enemy of the good, right? Like this doesn't go far enough, so I'm going to vote against it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, my colleague Rui Teixeira has been on a tear with all this stuff about, the Democrats chasing out the white working class. I've been on a bit of a tear about how the Republicans chased out the most reliable voters of their coalition, college-educated, suburban families who want to send their kids to college. You would think amidst all of this that you would see some profound changes in the policy profiles of these parties, given that parties are supposed to represent the interests broadly understood of their coalitions, right? And so I think you can see more of it on the GOP side, where you see people like J.D. Vance, Josh Hawley, Marco Rubio, basically abandoning free market stuff to go more for industrial policy, Elizabeth Warren style economics, but with more rhetoric about freedom thrown in every now and then. I don't see it very much reflected in the Democratic coalitions and the Democratic Party's policy menu. That policy menu seems to have not changed much. And you tell me, I'm sure it takes a while for snakes to digest and all that kind of stuff, right? But like a party absorbs huge numbers of affluent, organized, high propensity voters into its coalition. You would think that those voters would start making themselves heard more. Is it because they're just anti-Trump and therefore that's what the part of the transaction they care about right now? Or do you think we're going to start to see the Democratic Party moderate on some economic issues, or I don't know, foreign policy issues? I don't know what the issues would be because of the influx of sort of white suburban voters?
Yeah, I think there has been a little of that, but you're right that I think it has been slower on the Democratic side. And I think I take your point that this is, some of this has to do with Donald Trump and also reactions. And this goes back to the last book I wrote, Learning from Loss, which is, this is in some ways a reaction to 2016. Like, one of the lessons that Democrats took out of Hillary Clinton's loss to Donald Trump in 2016 was that they didn't look unified enough, right? That, in part that the party, looked too internally divided. And you saw all these Democrats going into the 2020 cycle, kind of going out of their way to not look like spoilers, to not look like they were willing to burn everything down. And I think that created, kind of this tradition of party unity that I think has probably helped the Democratic Party up until fairly recently. That, even where there's a fair amount of policy disagreement on economics and on other things, on foreign policy, not all of that has spilled out into public view. No one wants to look like they're going to cost the party the next election. But you do see a little bit of adaptation, I think, on economic policy. And I don't know, and I'm not sure how much of that is, is reflected on like new demographics of the party versus, in some ways, maybe learning from Obama's first term in office, right? So, one of those lessons was that, obviously they don't dispute, Barack Obama remains a very popular and unifying figure within the Democratic Party, but he also suffered like one of the biggest midterm election losses in history in 2010. Mm-hmm. And he didn't do so well in 2012. Like the party, other than the White House, the party lost a lot of ground during those two terms. And one of the lessons I think that at least a fair number of Democrats learned was that the problem was the economic response to a recession, and that it was seen, I think, by many as it was too timid. It took too long for unemployment to get back down to reasonable levels, and they didn't want to make that mistake again with Biden. And so you had like I think an approach that was much more spendy, was willing, as you pointed out earlier, it was willing to risk inflation in order to keep unemployment from getting too high, in order to prevent a sharp recession. And And I think some of those voices, I think, felt that they were vindicated by the 2022 midterm elections, where, the party didn't suffer overwhelming losses. They kept control of the Senate, and didn't lose a whole lot in the House. It may be biting them in the butt for 2024, though, right? Where that response, did leave a legacy of some inflation that is probably hurting them today. So I think you've got some of that going on. I think you might be seeing some changes reflected in immigration policy, where the Democratic Party does seem to have moved left. I think one of the things that's been interesting to note over the last couple of years is kind of a resurgence of labor power, that there actually have been a number of pretty prominent high profile strikes in the last few years. Biden has in many ways really embraced them, but you also see like the changing face of labor. It does not look like the white working class that it looked like 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. It is much younger. It is much more union members of color, more women. And I think that has probably, led to some changes where the party has, moved left on immigration. And then, you do see possibly some changes in foreign policy. And this is, reflected in both parties, where the commitment to stopping, Russian aggression in Ukraine has been pretty bipartisan, but to the extent there are critics of it, it's coming on the Republican side right now. That reflects some sort of a shift. And commitment to Israel has been pretty bipartisan for a long time. To the extent there's pushback, it's on the left right now, which that really was not the case up until relatively recently.
So in my right-wing pundit world,
yeah,
right, where, although I use the word right-wing advisedly now because I increasingly look like a big squishy moderate to a lot of right-wingers. I don't think I moved nearly as much as they did, but that's a conversation for another day. The thing, look, I'm not a fan of Joe Biden's. I think everyone knows my feelings about Donald Trump. I think he's unfit, shouldn't be running, shouldn't be allowed to run, should have been impeached and removed, barred from running, all that stuff. And so, but the thing, just as a analytical thing, that a lot of my people cannot understand I should put it this way, cannot understand to our satisfaction, because I think I know a lot of the theories, because this is something we talk about a lot, why Biden has rejected opportunity after opportunity to do some sort of sister Souljah thing. Because in my anti-Trump universe, I swim in waters filled with people who want to be convinced to vote for Biden. And they want a signal that he's actually representative of the normie middle and not sort of beholden and manipulated by the sort of rabid left. The recent stuff on Israel has caused enormous number of these people in my universe to say, all right, I'm just done with this guy. And they're now thinking about voting for Trump in ways they never would have even 6 months ago. And I have different arguments for them at different times. But do you think the utility of sister Souljah type moves no longer makes sense in today's Democratic Party? Do you think it may or may not make sense, but it doesn't make sense for Joe Biden to do it? In an era of negative polarization, if trying to reach for the center does not work in the same way that it used to, what is your best guess or theory of the case about why Joe Biden has simply refused to pick meaningful fights with the serious left of his party, even purely cynical, totally unjustified on the merits fights, right? I mean, I don't care about that. Sometimes you have to sacrifice. You need a little ritual human sacrifice in politics and throw someone under a bus. Why do you think? What is your theory of the case about why he hasn't done that? Yeah,
so I wrote a piece about this at Tusk last year about how I wasn't even convinced that the sister Souljah thing worked in the case of sister Souljah. That is, okay. It's not 100% clear to me that these things work. That, and it's there's almost always like a racial angle to it, of just like finding someone, usually someone to the left, a person of color within the party, and just say, look, that's too far for me. I can't support that. And that's sort of a signal to more centrist white voters that, okay, maybe this person's still on my side. I'm not convinced that works all that much. I don't really know what Biden thinks about that. To some extent, I think he attempted to signal that in 2020 with his claim, as everyone was talking, marching in the streets saying defund the police. He was saying, no, actually, we need to fund the police. And he was not sounding nearly as conservative as Trump, but he was sounding more like a centrist on that. And I think you're right, though, he has not sought to do that this year so much. One of, I don't know if I see this as a strength or what, but like one of like Biden's main traits over like a 50-year career is trying to figure out where the center of the Democratic Party is and getting there before anyone else does. And he will listen to both, left and the, the moderate wings of the party and try and figure out what's going on. I think he sees the left. My impression is he probably sees, both the center and the left as wings that can keep him from getting reelected, right? And he feels like there's a lot of energy on the left, and it is very hard for him to keep both wings happy, particularly when Israel and Gaza are in the news every day. There's been some fascinating recent polling on this showing that, like, if you look at people's views, I'm trying to remember who had this. I think it was a recent Pew poll asking, people, well, who do you generally agree with on Israel, Gaza? Do you generally side with Israelis or generally side with Palestinians? There's a huge age gap on that question. The younger you are, the more likely you are to side with Palestinians. But like particularly within the Democratic Party, where, younger Democrats overwhelmingly, by like 30, 40 point margins, overwhelmingly side with Palestinians. Older Democrats overwhelmingly side with Israelis. That is not a bridge that he can really cross, right? Like he can't keep both those wings happy. I think he's sort of doing what he can to placate each side, but I think he's hoping that issue just goes away in the next 6 months, which I don't know that it's going to do. I think he may have been scared a little bit by what happened in the Michigan primary back in March, which wasn't a huge anti-Biden vote, but there were like, what was it, something like 14% of the vote was simply none of the above. Like I'm voting Democratic, but I'm not voting for Biden. And the whole narrative about that was like that was pushing against his support of Israel. And I think he sees the polls every day suggesting, well, if he doesn't at least do something to appease the left, they're going to stay home. But he can't go too far in that direction because that's costing him the center. I'm not sure. I'm sure he's feeling kind of paralyzed right now. And I really wouldn't, if he asked me for advice, I do not know what I would tell him to do. That's a hard call.
Okay. So two things I want to pull on there. One is I agree with you. I think it used to be a controversial thing to say about Joe Biden that he wasn't a centrist. He was a centrist within the borders of the Democratic Party, which is a different thing, right? Historically, if you're talking about a centrist, you were talking about like Sam Nunn, right? One of those like actual conservative Democrats that made him, in some ways more conservative than some liberal Republicans, but, still on the Democratic side. Like, and Biden's always been sort of a triangulator within the universe of the Democratic Party. And so, as you said, under Obama, the Democratic Party actually got shellacked more than once, right? And one of the consequences of that, as part of this ongoing, unfolding sorting of American voters, is that the bench of moderate Democrats just got decimated, right? I mean, they were the ones on Obamacare and that kind of stuff. Southern Democrats, and I don't mean like Jim Crow era Southern Democrats. I mean like just like normal, more centrist, more Joe Manchin-like Democrats. Those were the people who were wiped out in red states in the Obama years. And so what happened was the net center of gravity of the Democratic Party moved left because the left of the party got bigger, not only got bigger in absolute terms, but in relative terms to the rest of the party, right? The big city liberal guys just dominated. And so that moved the center of gravity, and therefore the center that Biden wants to inhabit, leftward. And so the question is, like, when you say he's in touch with both wings of the party, who is the centrist? What is it? Literally, I kind of like I demand names, sir. Who's a conservative or centrist Democrat? I mean, I mean, on Israel, which I agree is complicated, which I want to get to in a second. It's complicated for all sorts of complicated reasons that complicate the complications with complications. But like Fetterman is not a right-wing Democrat, except on the issue of Israel, right? So like, who is he triangulating against? I can see who he's triangulating against, on the left, to his left, but who is pulling him rightward? I mean, like, I just don't know who that is.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is a fair point, and this is really, I mean, this is part of the story. Some of this is from the Obama years, but some of this is just a larger story of both parties over the last several decades. That there were New England Republicans. That was a thing for a long time who were fairly
now
liberal on a
Collins.
lot of issues. Right, that's kind of it. And there's what passes for like the moderate wing of the party is way more toward the polls than it used to be. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I'm thinking of I keep coming back to names like John Hickenlooper or maybe Michael Bennet, who are just sort of very, very mainstream Democratic senators who do not have, vote with a lot of party priorities. Probably, I don't know, Joe Manchin may have been the last of anything that looks like a vaguely conservative Democrat, and he's on his way out the door. So there's just not a lot of that anymore. And I think he's maybe sort of triangulating to try and pick up what he sees as more moderate to conservative, white Democratic voters in places like Michigan and Wisconsin, in the Rust Belt, who are people who, still have some ties to the labor movement and in some elections will vote Democratic. But not all the time. They don't necessarily like the leftward direction of the party that they've perceived over the last few decades. But they're not completely out of his reach. And Biden is the type of candidate who, at least in the past, has been able to pick up support of people like that. So it's a way more vague sense, but I think that's who he sees as kind of anchoring the right end of the party's coalition.
Also, I mean, again, we're also just in this weird transitional moment where when we were growing up, when you talked about the left wing of the Democratic Party, you tended to talk disproportionately about black people, right? I mean, the black left was really dominant in the Democratic Party. The voters who got Biden the nomination were black ladies in South Carolina in their 50s, right? I mean, it was like, and the median black voter now is probably to the right of like the median, white city voter. I mean, it's like the black voter is no longer the stand-in for the left wing of the Democratic Party in ways it was, when Jesse Jackson was running, right? And so that just makes the sort of standard triangulation analysis weirder, because a lot of people think, oh, well, if you're catering to the black vote in the Democratic Party, that means you're moving left. Not necessarily, right? Like the Beto O'Rourke voter is way to the left of the average sort of black Jim Clyburn voter. And that, I think, scrambles a lot of people's assumptions.
Yeah, I agree.
The other thing is, and we can get to the Israel stuff in a second, but like, it seems to me that at the sort of the meta level, one of the reasons why we can't have nice things is that neither party wants to win with 60% of the vote anymore. They each are trying to win with 50.1, right? There are base elections, and that's clearly Trump, right? I mean, Trump is all but shouted from the rooftops he would rather be the all-powerful king of a rump party than an important voice in a majority party, right? And similarly, this lack of Sister Souljah stuff kind of thing, it really feels like the Democrats are bought into this idea of just getting enough of their base turned out to win by one vote. And that constrains both parties to use rhetoric and positioning that turns off middle voters. This is my thesis of the case. So do you think that there's a part, because I don't think you get out of this mess of being beholden to the base the way both parties are until one party wins big enough that it has the the maneuvering room to say no to its base. And I mean, like, we see this vividly with the House Freedom Caucus types, right? I mean, like, it's on display in microcosm with these stupid ass motion to vacate fights, where a handful of people get to try to dictate how 96% of the party should behave because everybody's empowered as their own individual monkey wrench person. So I guess the question is, first of all, do you think that's right? And second of all, do you think we will see in the next, forget our lifetimes, because the way I live, 50 is the new 60. But do you think in the next 20 years we're going to see a party actually win 55 to 60% of the vote in a presidential election? Is that possible? And will they try?
See, I might disagree with you here in part. And first of all, thank God, like, it's, we've been agreeing way too much. But I don't know that the parties are not interested in winning big. I just don't think it's possible, right? Mm-hmm. That we're at such a stage in polarization, at least at the national level, where, every election in the 21st century has been like really close. And we used to have landslides, in 72 and in 84 and 64. We just don't have double digit wins anymore. The closest we got, was 2008, where Obama won by something, was like 7 or 8 points, I think. Mm-hmm. In a year where you had an unpopular 2-term president on the way out the door, during one of the biggest recessions we've ever had, during an unpopular war, and he still only won by like 8 points. Mm-hmm. Also, like, a singularly very talented politician. That's, I think, the biggest we're going to see, and things have even polarized further since then. But that doesn't mean that the parties aren't trying. One of the things that actually, like, if you look at Trump's language on abortion, he's actually he's triangulating something there, mm-hmm, right? Mm-hmm. Like, he knows his reputation as, among like pro-life groups, and he's trying to sound like he's not that extreme, and he's like, well, we'll see what happens with a national ban, but I think states should make up their own minds. Like, I feel like he's still trying to, like, sort of win the center on that. I think Biden is trying to some extent, or he sees himself as the candidate of the center, but it's still going to be, we're in an era where candidates basically get 46 to 48% of the vote. And it comes down to a few tens of thousands of vote in like 5 or 6 swing states. I don't see what's going to shake that up over the next 10 or 20 years. I think which state is the swing state that does shift around a little bit. Right. But it's not clear to me what's ultimately going to lead one party to do a lot better than the other. And I think that actually causes real problems, as you're pointing out. Like, one of the good things about losing a landslide election is that it actually gets your party on board with the idea of okay, we actually have to change our direction. Right. This was, I think, probably healthy for the Democrats in the 1980s to just have a string of losses that were pretty embarrassing. It was probably healthy for Republicans in 64. To suffer a bad loss and say, well, we can't go that far in that direction that quickly. Mm-hmm. And whereas with the way things are now, everyone within the party could say, well, if we just did this a little differently, if we just run a few more ads in Wisconsin or something like that, we would have won. No one ever has the incentive to really majorly rethink things. And everyone thinks they didn't, well, we lost, but we didn't really lose.
So one of the things that is, I have been told, I'm curious to see if you agree with this. There's certain things that, like, experts all agree on and the general public just doesn't believe you. There are very few economists out there who don't generally agree that some sort of like VAT or consumption tax wouldn't be the most efficient way to collect revenue, but there's just no way politically you could ever do it. So it's just like, it's plate spinning act in academia. Similarly, my understanding among political scientists is that basically the turnout myth, the turnout theories is something of a myth. That turnout always benefits Democrats is a myth. Right. And that this idea that if everybody voted, basically election results would look pretty much the way they look. Right. Which makes sense when you think about it. If you think about like a poll, It's a sampling of 1,100 people, if it's a good one, 1,500 people, if it's a great one. And that ends up being predictive and representative of 330 million people. Well, on election day, when you have 100 million people voting, that's a huge sample size, right? And so the amount of variation you'd get if everybody turned out. So first of all, do you generally agree with that? That like this idea that somehow if everybody voted, our elections would look considerably, I'm not saying they wouldn't look different at the margins, but would consistently move us leftward? Because there's this idea which you often find of like a hidden, like Bernie Sanders thinks there's this reserve army of proletarians that if you just activate them, America would lurch towards social democracy tomorrow. And now the Trumpists kind of believe that there's this reserve army of nationalists, and if you just activate them, I don't know, we go invade Poland or something. But like, where do you come down on that? And then I have a follow-up question about it.
Yeah. I mean, I would say from what I've read on this, most of the suggestion is there, like, if we did have 100% voter turnout, it wouldn't necessarily advantage one party, right, more than it's currently advantaged. Like, it wouldn't scramble things that much. I do think you would have some differences in emphasis on policy. You might have somewhat more liberal bend on things like the welfare state than you do now. You might have actually a somewhat more right-wing bend on things like foreign policy than you do now,
or immigration,
or immigration. Yeah, agreed. So I think that would sort of shift things. I think, and incumbent politicians would be cognizant of like, well, I have to keep this group of voters in mind who weren't necessarily voting before. And that might cause, a different set of issues, but I don't think it would mean like we're going to have a generation of Democratic Congresses or anything like that.
So the reason I ask this is I am against mandatory voting on principled grounds. Like, I just think it's basically compelled speech. I don't think it's constitutional. But I'd really like to have it for a couple of elections. If someone could convince me, get me, if Larry Tribe could do for me what he did for Biden and convince him all sorts of unconstitutional things are constitutional, that'd be great. So, and the reason why I'm attracted to it is not because I want to make everybody, vote. I think compelled voting does not increase the net patriotism of the country or anything like that. But the way the parties are structured now, the incentive is to turn out as many of your most passionate people possible, and dissuade as many of their marginal voters to just stay home, right? And if everybody voted, then the crazies who dominate primaries don't matter anymore, right? The turning up the gain on the most committed doesn't make any sense. You just go where the most votes are. And you would try to get as many of your base voters as you could, but not if they were going to cost, if picking up each marginal base voter cost you 1.5 voters in the center, never mind 3.5 voters in the center, you just wouldn't do it, right? You just wouldn't lean in that much because turnout is not the issue anymore. And so the reason why I like this thought experiment is I'm trying to think of ways to get it back to the way it was when we were growing up, which was that you ran a little bit to the ideological fringe in the primaries to get not total support from the base, but enough of the support to add to the sort of moderates that you had in your column to win the primary and get the nomination. And then you ran to the center. And that dynamic, because of the sort, for all the reasons that you know better than I do, just doesn't exist anymore. Are there structural changes to the parties that would increase the attractiveness of trying to reach the median voter rather than the fringe voter, that would work along the same lines, do you think, as sort of the mandatory voting thing? And maybe you think I'm wrong about the mandatory voting thing. That you can say that too.
Well, I mean, one of the things I think is that, what the next 6 months look like is going to be different from the last. In the sense that you're going to see a lot of the presidential campaign focus just on a handful of swing states. And there will be, I think, a lot more effort to convert voters, rather than just to get the base passionate. Like the base is mostly going to turn out. They're going to be, there's going to be a lot of extensive advertising talking about how like they're the choice of the center in places like Arizona and Georgia and Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. So there will be some of that. One of the things that could change, and it's hard to speculate what exactly that would look like. Getting rid of the electoral college, again, not super realistic anytime in the near future. But making it not about just the handful of states, and forcing the candidates to campaign more broadly. I'm not sure what changes within the party would look like there. I mean, I think so much of this has been a conversation about Donald Trump, who largely doesn't pivot after the primary because I just don't think he has that capability physically. Like, everyone kept expecting the pivot in 2016, and he just doesn't know how to do it.
I would say that Obama didn't really pivot very much after he got the nomination either.
Not a ton, right?
Right, because again, this base turnout strategy, does not incentivize pivoting. Right.
And I think, Biden's advantage, like what helped him in the primaries in 2020 was that he was already seen someone who didn't have to pivot. He was already acceptable to the center. Right. And he did not go out of his way to cater to the left, which is kind of where most of the other candidates were in that cycle. So yeah, you don't really see a lot of pivoting anymore. And I remember, like, I'm old enough to remember when pivoting was seen as something it was seen as deceitful, right? I mean, we don't know where these candidates stand. They do this in this election. They do this in another election. I guess we're getting who they really are now, right? But I don't know that that's making people happy either.
So just I just want to circle back on the Israel thing for a second and not get into the weeds on the actual policy of it. But it seems to me that getting back to where he started with the vibes, Biden's changing positions on Israel, perception being the only thing here, right? Of backing Israel to the hilt rhetorically and then saying, okay, but you can't go into Rafah and we're not going to get these weapons. That seems to me to underscore Biden's vibe problem, which is that he's vacillating. He doesn't seem in charge, in command. He doesn't convey mastery of the presidency. And you combine that with the age stuff, it seems to me that that's the biggest vibe thing going on right now. And it's not the actual issues. I tend to think that, like, his low rating on handling of issues is the causality is backwards. It's not people think he's handling the issues wrong. It's they think he's wrong and therefore he's getting the issues wrong. If you were advising him about changing his vibe generally, what would you tell him to do?
Oh man, that's the really annoying thing about vibes is, like, they're even harder to change than, underlying structure. I mean, and this has been a frustrating area for me because, like, my own perception, based on years following politics, but also being a political scientist for 20 plus years now, is that product matters way more than salesmanship. And yet there's a salesmanship problem here that I don't think he's quite put his finger on. And I don't know that I'd have for this. The real problem for him is that, like, it's generally healthy in an election to look like the moderate, right? More than an extremist. That we know that voters tend to prefer moderation. The problem is when your moderation can also look like vacillation, right?
Right.
And you end up in a situation which Biden finds himself in, where, like, he was, as you pointed out, big supporter of Israel following October 7th, but then he's like, but actually you can't go too far because this is a real problem. And so he's trying to sort of find the middle on there, and as a result, he ends up pleasing no one. And both sides consider him a sellout. Now, why that looks like a sellout in one circumstance and moderation in another is not super clear to me. Right. And I would generally say, on average, it's good to be, to look like the moderate. But this is something that I remember, like, following Bill Clinton's presidency, moderation probably in the long run really helped him out. And by his second term, I think he was seen as, like, this is someone who is not too radical and the economy's grown pretty well. And so he had high approval ratings that sustained him during what otherwise would have been a pretty extreme series of crises. But in his first term, he was widely criticized for waffling, right? For taking too long to reach a decision, for reaching compromises that please no one on like gays in the military and other issues. Why is that vibes? Is that being a better kind of moderate in the second term than he was in the first term? I'm really not sure. And I know that's not a satisfactory answer with someone who's allegedly an expert in this topic, but
it'll have to do. I appreciate it. Thanks for doing this, man. I appreciate it.
Hey, thanks so much, Jonah. This is great. Appreciate it.
Okay, so Professor Masket has left the studio, and I want to thank him for coming on short notice, and I want to apologize to people if I was more logorrheic than I normally am. Just a little distracted today, and what had my head going in a bunch of different directions. But I'm grateful to Seth for playing along. Do check out his newsletter, Tusk, and if you are a poli-sci nerd, check out his books. He's a very accessible, very interesting, non-bombastic political scientist, and a really decent, good dude. So anyway, okay, so and there's one thing I need to prepare people for. It's hopefully something that you will barely notice, except in positive ways. But because in internet years, I am Methuselah, I have seen it all. We are migrating, redesigning the entire website. Don't worry, all the great stuff that you like about it, clean, easy to read, no pop-up stuff, all that, that's all, that stuff is not changing. But we're, changing the platform and the doodads, and we're disconnecting the Franfras from the Queenestrays and reattaching new vulcanized rubber doohickeys to the whatchamacallits. And that might, I'm just saying might, mess up like some of the private feeds on the podcasts, and might make things that you have to reload or resubscribe to. We don't know. And we're trying very, very hard to make this as invisible to people in any negative way as possible. But it's coming. Better that you be on the lookout for it and not think, dear God, what is happening? And start sacrificing oxen to Baal, or worshiping golden calves because you've lost faith in us, or in humanity, or in life itself. We just want you to be prepared to gird your loins, to stiffen your spines, to keep your heads on a swivel. And hopefully this will be all overkill and none of it will matter, because everything will go so seamlessly that and so perfectly that they'll be rejoicing in the land. But I just wanted to get it out there. It's coming in the next week to 10 days, something like that. And obviously, if you've got issues, you get in touch with us and we will deal with them as quickly and as politely and expeditiously as possible. So with that, thanks for listening, and I will see you next time.
No, you won't. This is a podcast.